Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Mark Storella, and I am the director of the African Studies Center here at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. We are celebrating still our 70th anniversary, allegedly the second oldest African Studies Center in the nation.
First best.
And the best. Woo. Allegedly Northwestern is older.
They don't count.
They don't count. Thank you for joining us in the Walter Rodney Seminar Series. And we are delighted, and I would even say excited today to be welcoming a prodigal son of Boston University, Professor Abel Amado. And I will introduce him briefly. And Abel, you can correct my introduction if you'd like. You can add, subtract, or divide. He is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Simmons University, right down the street. He did his undergraduate work in International Relations at the Technical University of Lisbon and the University of Massachusetts at Boston. However, the most important academic experience that Abel Amado had was here as a PhD at Boston University, where he received his PhD in Political Science and African Studies. He is co-director of the University of Rhode Island's Summer Abroad program in Cabo Verde. He is on the board, and incidentally, he notes that he is an active board member of the West African Studies Association, which is housed here at the African Studies Center at Boston University. Professor Amado's research is extensive, and it focuses on African countries in particular with Portuguese languages as official languages, but that also means that he has a particular interest in all things related to the colonial experience in Africa. Your research has focused on the quality of democracy in post-colonial Africa and the impact of post-colonial language policies. I personally think this is a fascinating subject, and we happen upon it everywhere we go in Africa, but not only in Africa, but especially in Africa. His work also focuses on anti-colonialism in the Portuguese-speaking parts of Africa, called by the acronym PALOP, is that correct?
PALOP, yes.
PALOP. He has done work for publication on independence movements in Cabo Verde and Guinea-Bissau. He's worked on the foreign policy of the PALOP region, and in particular, international relations of countries in the PALOP region and the United States. So these are subjects, frankly, of great interest to all of us. Before we unleash our professor and speaker of the day to make his presentation, which is entitled Anti-Colonial Nationalism in Portuguese Africa and the Language Question, I think we will do as we usually do and go around the room here and let the folks who are actually in physical attendance present themselves. I regret that those of you, the 20 or so online, we won't invite you to present yourselves, but we will invite you to participate in questions and answers. So let's go around the table, beginning with
Hi, I'm
Professor
Cynthia Becker. I'm from the History of Art and Architecture Department, and I can't wait to hear you talk.
And I'm Parker Shipton, and I can't wait either. My experience in Portuguese Africa has seldom gotten even out of the airport. But I'm trying to catch up a little bit by listening to the radio when I'm on the rowing machine. And the station that I prefer to learn Portuguese from is the one called Nossa Rádio USA, which is mostly Brazilian and mostly talks about either politics, about religion, which is simple because you've heard it all before somewhere, about politics, which you might have heard before, and every other word is Bolsonaro. And so that's halfway easy. And then the live coverage of soccer is absolutely impossible.
Absolutely. That was quite an introduction.
Mine will be shorter.
Okay.
I'm Dave Bubsky. I'm in the history department here. And Abel and I know each other because we were on the board of the, well, I guess we're still on the board of the Lisbon African Studies Organization.
That's good.
Hi, I'm Lynn Beardies. I'm a postdoctoral scholar with the Society of Fellows here. I'm affiliated with African American Black Diaspora Studies and the Musicology and Ethnomusicology Department. And I'm Beth Rustick, and head of the African Studies Library.
which is also celebrating its 70th anniversary. Which day was it? It was about 2 weeks ago?
It
now?
was about 2 weeks.
2 weeks ago, we had a lovely celebration at the library. Wonderful experience. Okay, well, we're ready to begin. And so I would right now like to turn to Professor Amado to begin his presentation. He'll speak for how long do you think?
35, 40 minutes talk.
35,
So
40
that will
minutes?
give us another 40 minutes for Q&A.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, great.
So
Professor Amado, it's
thank you so
floor
much
is
for
yours.
this wonderful introduction. It is always a pleasure to come back home, as you mentioned earlier. A little bit of rectification. I think it's time for me to update my bio online.
good.
So I'm no longer a board member of West African Research Association.
Ah,
So that's something in the past.
I
but,
bet they would be glad to get you to join again.
Just take full credit, didn't you learn anything here?
But I guess before I start my presentation, I want to make a challenge to the center. Has PALOPS, the Portuguese-speaking African countries are going to celebrate their 50th anniversary of independence. Maybe something that needs to be
Interesting.
start off next year for at least one-day conference or something. So, and I
Interesting.
think that would be great to have a panel at least to discuss these interesting landmark.
We have a long history of PILOP stuff here at BU.
Yes,
And
yes.
currently, in the Boston area, there's lots of people working on Lusco in Africa.
Do you happen to know, Abel, if any of the Gulf countries have diplomatic representation here in Boston?
Cabo Verde has
Cabo Verde,
consulate.
that's right.
Yeah, but
All
the
right,
others are
it's starting to take shape.
okay. Okay, so my talk is about the larger question in the context of anti-colonial nationalism in Portuguese Africa. I will try to go as fast as possible in order to deliver the most. And perhaps, if something is not clear, you can always take the opportunity during a Q&A section to ask me questions. Okay, now my screen is frozen.
Uh-oh. Something's happening, huh?
Do you see my?
No. It's no longer shared.
I'm actually.
Looks like it's
Okay,
coming back.
we're just gonna go like that. So I want to briefly start by pointing out the key objectives of this presentation. First, the main objective is to map out some of the key language practices, ideologies, and institutions in the context of national liberation. And again, I want to emphasize that my paper does not engage in critical discourse analysis, focus more on what we can call the external dimension of language, meaning what languages are chosen to be the main medium for political mobilization and political communication in general. I also want to emphasize that the key argument of this paper is to mention that the practice of anti-colonial nationalism in what was then called Portuguese Africa stood on two main pillars. First, the multilingualism, and the second, a little bit of Portuguese linguistic supremacy, as I will show in a moment. Again, as you can imagine, to talk about anti-colonial nationalism in the context of Portuguese Africa or in Africa in general, it's about talking a multitude of political actors, political parties, liberation organizations, and so on and so forth. For the purpose of my presentation, I will focus on the three mainstream ones, the PAIGC, MPLA, and FRELIMO. So just in terms of contextualizing my research, I want to briefly engage in a lit review by connecting it with the literature of nationalism, as we do know, particularly in the case of Western European nationalism, which many scholars like Hobsbawm, Kohn, Plamenats, You know, they make a distinction between two different types of nationalism in Europe, the Western nationalism, which is civic territorial, and the Eastern nationalism, which is more based on, on what is now called ethno-nationalism. And, obviously, we do find the trend towards developing a nationalism literature in Africa, something that started as African states were becoming independent in the 1950s and 1960s, particularly. One author that comes to my mind right now is Hodgkin, who wrote an interesting book in 1957 on African nationalism. Now, in the case of Portuguese-speaking African countries, there are three aspects or three key elements that I need to mention. First, the case study approach is the chosen approach to study nationalism. There is a ton of studies, nonetheless. What we see is studies that focus on individual countries. And you have the case of Chabal, who has studied Guinea-Bissau, Mustafa Dada, Isaac studying Mozambique, and so on. Classical book by John Markham that focuses on Angola, etc., etc. Also, some of these scholars, they tend to focus on leadership, the role of leadership. Chabal is a good example. More recently, you have Antonio Tomás, or even Isaacman, who has written a book on Samora Machel of Mozambique. So what it is very interesting to notice, despite the vibrancy and robustness of the literature on anti-colonial nationalism in Portuguese Africa, there is scholars have neglected the language question, and this is where my paper is situated. So to take another, give you a little bit more of background, you may want to ask, what is the point of studying anti-colonial nationalism in the language question? I mean, I think that we can present several reasons. First of all, by focusing on the language question, we are opening a new window of understanding nationalism in Africa by focusing on the language itself. For instance, looking at the linguistic features, as we shall see later on, for instance, Eduardo Mondlane of Mozambique was talking about creating a new Portuguese language, right, by lexical modernization in order to make the Portuguese language a language free of fascism. So that is one dimension that needs to be explored. I also want to emphasize what I call circularity of ideas. Leaders of these organizations not only had a long history of personal friendship, they became politically intimate. From the 1950s, when many of them met in Lisbon as college students, they organized and formed what can be called the underground anti-colonial public sphere. They met regularly and shared the idea. From that point on, it was continuously developed, this type of partnership. And during the war, as we shall see in a moment, we do find the establishment of a transnational organization whose key role was to coordinate the actions of all individual anti-colonial liberation movements. And finally, I think that by studying the language question in the context of anti-colonial nationalism, it allows us to understand a little bit of this continuity from the colonial state into the post-colonial state. I believe that in no other policy domain, the continuity is stronger. As a matter of fact, if you look at post-colonial language policy in the PALOP, we don't see as much difference from the old colonial language policy. And finally, given the policy choices made by liberation movements and then the post-colonial state in Africa that was formerly under Portuguese rule, what we do see is the viability of Portuguese as an international language is dependent on the African states themselves. Two-thirds of Portuguese-speaking African countries or countries with Portuguese as the official language are on the African continent, right? the other three, as you know, are Brazil, East Timor, and Portugal. So the PALOPs, what I prefer, by the way, I prefer the term PALOPs and not Lusophone Africa, but we can have a conversation later about it, represent the 2/3 of countries with Portuguese as an official language, and can give us a lot of international visibility to the language itself. Now, I want us to move to the historical contextualization to understand a little bit in terms of what they call the Portuguese linguistic supremacy by briefly looking at the colonial state and the language question. As we all know, Portuguese were the first to arrive in Africa and the last to depart. Especially in the 1950s and 1960s, many scholars were talking about the massive migrants from Portugal into Africa. Jean Penven has an interesting paper on Against the Tide. I think that is the title of the paper. The objective was to show that while other European powers were withdrawing from Africa, Portugal was sending the migrants to there. To jump a little bit, I think that by looking at the late colonial state in Portuguese Africa, we can find two different moments. The first moment can be thought of in terms of Portugal não é país pequeno. So that phrase itself represented this mental and discursive construction of the empire. The second moment is aqui é Portugal. Here is Portugal, which was essentially referred to the colonies in Africa. The idea of a pluricontinental and pluriracial nation. So, and these two discursive systems, they all based on this idea of supremacy of Portugal. Of Portuguese, right? The first one, obviously, for Portugal is not a small country. A nation empire, needless to say, need to emphasize its core identitary element, which is language. The second discourse, that of pluricontinental and pluriracial nation, entails that the Portuguese language itself would become the key cement that would glue members from across the empire. Just to understand a little bit in terms of the colonial state discourse on language, I think there is a couple of key concepts that I need to emphasize. Some of them were put forth way before the phase of late colonial state. For instance, the discourse of anti-cafrialização, or what I call anti-cafrialização. One way of us understanding this discourse, it would be the cafrialização would be something akin to what the British used to call going native, right? Cafrialização, this idea of keeping as much distance from the African cultural systems and the cultural linguistic systems in order to avoid any possible contamination into the Portuguese language. Indigenato, again, another interesting concept, basically establish a hierarchy and a classification of Africans in two groups: the assimilados, or those who were given political and civil rights, and the natives who did not have political rights. In the Acordo Missionário here, I brought it here just to emphasize that in the late period of Portuguese colonial state, the emphasis on language was so much that it became embedded in many of international agreements. So the agreement between the Holy See and Portugal, the Acordo Missionário, clearly emphasized that Portuguese should be the only language for mission schools, meaning that missionaries who were not competent in Portuguese language would be rejected by Portugal to go to Africa. So a kind of a rupture with past traditions. Okay. Now, because I like to bring images, I think that to conceptualize those two discourses, these two posters give us an idea about those two discursive systems. The idea of Portugal is not a small country, and the other discursive system is, aqui é Portugal, which became one of the key and dominant discourse in the 1950s, 1960s in particular, to emphasize that, even though these territories were on the African continent, they're still part of Portuguese nation. Right? This poster is very interesting because, this was taken from a phrase coined by Portuguese leader António Salazar, who mentioned that Mozambique, porque Portugal. It says Mozambique is only Mozambique because it's Portugal, right? To show the intimate connection between this. Okay, now, now that we have established the contextualization of the colonial state, let's a little bit spend perhaps a few minutes to discuss the anti-colonial nationalism in Portuguese Africa very, very quickly. As I pointed out earlier, 1950s and 1960s in these former Portuguese colonies, as elsewhere in Africa, we do find a boom of anti-colonial organizations. Some small, others well organized, etc. But you could classify this multitude of organizations into three major groupings. First, the ethno-nationalists, meaning that they want to reclaim the ethnic identity and create their own state, a kind of nation state. A good example would be, for instance, Ngwizaku from Angola, like Ngwizaku meaning understanding of the Congo, right? Meaning it brought together Congo-speaking groups from Angola to create an autonomous state. You have another second stream of anti-colonial nationalism, which what I call the territorialists. They accepted the colonial borders, and the idea was to develop a modern state, a modern nation state, if you will, along the borders imposed by European colonialism. And finally, a third stream of anti-colonial organization is what they call trans-territorial coordinating organizations. You have, for instance, the CONCP, the Conference of Nationalist Organizations from Portuguese colonies, and that brought together those three major organizations that I'm going to focus on. The other trans-territorial organization was formed by rival groups to oppose CONCP, the African Front Against Portuguese colonialism. Obviously, anti-colonial nationalism in Portuguese Africa was in many ways unique, given the liberation struggle. Okay, so this is what I have in terms of contextualization. Now, I want to move to the key topic of my presentation, the language question. As I pointed out, I will focus on the three key aspects of the language question. Excuse me. Language practice, language institutions, and language ideologies. Again, looking at these three major organizations. What I'll try to do is a sort of comparative approach and to emphasize how ideas were shared among leaders and how some of these key ideas regarding language circulated within this anti-colonial group. So in terms of anti-colonial organizations and the language question, I want to mention that these organizations are essentially multilinguistic apparatuses. And de facto multilingualism, especially in the early days, was a key feature of these organizations. Nonetheless, there is still a dominance of Portuguese. Perhaps a good example is the case, say, of Frelimo. Before the advent of Frelimo, you had MANU, Mozambican African National Union, It is interesting to note that Manu did not use Portuguese as the language of recruitment and mobilization. But when Frelimo came into existence by bringing Manu into other organizations, one of the first informal policy was to make Portuguese as the key language of internal communication. Needless to say, there was a reshuffling in terms of power, right? Those who are not proficient in Portuguese were, pushed aside. These organizations, they were veritable translation machines in the sense that, as I will show you in a moment, they dealt with a multitude of audiences, and message had to be translated in order to reach to these different audiences. Political leadership in many ways correlated with language competence, particularly competence in languages of wider communication, English and French, as we shall see in a moment. Many or some of these leaders felt compelled to tackle the language questions because, as you can imagine, there was a little bit of language debate within this organization, especially in the mid of the Liberation War, as proto-state structures were being constructed and some services were provided to population in the liberated areas. When it comes to education, for instance, a debate on what language should be the medium of teaching became a common denominator in all of these three organizations. So another image. So this is what I tend to do in order to conceptualize the different audiences. And when we look at the different audiences, we see that there is an emphasis on different languages. For domestic audiences, we are looking at the Portuguese, local languages, and Creole, as in the case of Cabo Verde and Guinea-Bissau. For transnational audiences, which by transnational, I mean the contacts with civil society organizations, particularly in the Western world, in the US, in Western Europe. So there was a reliance on French or English, and a little bit of Portuguese. And for international communication, meaning communication to other states, independent states, and to international organizations, the medium of choice was French and later English. I need to footnote myself here why French was the main language of communication. And if you are familiar with Portuguese education system at that time, you'll see that the first foreign language was French. So many of these folks, they were quite competent in French. Even when I went to school, obviously it was after independence, but we still find the legacy of Portuguese curriculum. I had to study French for 5 years, which I did not like it, but that's a different question. So to give you an example of how different languages were used to reach out different audiences. For domestic audience, this is the case of PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde. You had, in the written format, the use of Ajami. I really hope that Falu was around so he could have helped us with translation. We have Portuguese, but also we have Creole. So those two languages were used as part of a process of reaching out to the local population for either mobilization or extraction of resources. Other examples, I have many examples. Now, this is the case of a communique from MPLA in Kimbundu. Another communique from MPLA, it's a bilingual Portuguese, and the back verse is in Kimbundu. Again, from MPLA, on the same page, we have a bilingual communication, right? Portuguese and then Kimbundu. And now, when it comes to the Portuguese audience, obviously it's Portuguese only. The other flyer is directed against the Portuguese soldier, trying to tell them to, that is not a just war, if you will. This is directed to the Angolan soldiers in the Portuguese colonial army. It's in Portuguese. No, this is a bit too small for me to not remember, but I think it's either Kikongo or Kimbundu, but I cannot decide. And now another example, this is the case of Mozambique, as I pointed out earlier. In the early days, we do have examples of use of African language as part of mobilization. What is interesting, this is they use Kiswahili a lot in the mobilization campaigns. Now, I should also note that in time, the Portuguese colonial state responded in the same way by relying on the local languages, as part of counterinsurgency language policy, if you will, right? Perhaps the best way to reach the local population is to use their own language. What we see, for instance, in the case of Guinea-Bissau, the use of Creole, right? Va present an autoridade, go present yourself before the authorities. The other flyer is a safe passage, salvo conduto. And what is interesting is not only it's a multilingualism, but also the semiotic message behind it. Look at the safe passage represents the Portuguese flag. Again, the old idea of Portuguese nation. Okay. Moving on. Now, if these organizations are, as I mentioned earlier, multilingual institutions, then there is a role to be played by bilinguals. So one of the arguments that I make in this paper, and by the way, something I should have mentioned, this paper is part of a project that I'm currently engaged in, which is about studying and engaging in a political study of Portuguese language in Africa. Bilinguals do play an important role. But before I do that, I want to briefly classify who are the bilinguals. I make a distinction between hyper-bilinguals. These are those who were proficient in Portuguese and other international languages. Needless to say, they tended to be the key leaders. And then you have the hyper-bilinguals, also play an important role because they were a sort of a transmission belt between leadership and local population, right? They translate Portuguese into local language or into Creole, okay? Then you have the other two groups, which are either, we can call them horizontal bilinguals, meaning they speak two or more local language, and the monolinguals. I also want to argue that political ascension within this organization was correlated to competence in another vehicular language. In the case of Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde, Creole played an important role, but in the case of Mozambique and Angola, Portuguese. So it is interesting to note that you do not find either military leader or a political leader who at least had some competence in Portuguese. Right? This in the case of MPLA and Frelimo. So obviously we do come to this hierarchy, but moving on, because and the question that we should ask ourselves is, what functions do these bilingual play in the context of anti-colonial struggle? First, obviously, the most common one is translation and interpretation. They play the key role not only to translate the message, to interpret the message to the local population, but even to the international audience. These bilinguals, they were also language planners in a way, because they did engage in some sort of language planning, particularly lexical modernization. So in the case, for instance, of PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, we do find the import of many words from Portuguese into the local language, into Creole. So obviously corpus planning was a key dimension. By corpus planning, I mean the internal dimension of the word, the lexical component, or even at the syntactic level. So we do find some modifications in the local language. Now, I have another couple of images that I want to share so it can become clear to us. So we do find the use of the French for international communication, in this case, more like a public, what I call public diplomacy of liberation, trying to reach out to the public in other states, not to the government per se, but at least to create a sense of justness of the war in Portuguese Africa. But we also find the use of the French language in diplomatic relations. This is a letter from Amado Cabral to one of the ministers of now extinct Czechoslovakia Republic. Another figure that I want to share with you is an example of hypo-bilingual. This is a person translating to the local population some of the communication from PIGC, so connecting the organization and local population. So they did play an important role, even though we don't hear a lot from them. So that is something that needs to be studied. So obviously, if you are still talking about language practices, which we are, we may want to look at how local languages were used. These languages were used as main medium of political mobilization or even for extraction of resources later on. And in the case of Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde, we do find a Creole language, but in case of Mozambique, it was not an intermediary language, if you will, right? In the case of Guinea-Bissau, you had Portuguese, then the intermediary stratum, Creole, and then local languages. As I mentioned earlier, we do find this lexical modernization. Urdang, who visited Guinea-Bissau in 1974, reports some of these new lexicon which had become part of Creole language in Guinea-Bissau. Expressions like militant, political commissary político, responsável, which I don't think there is actually a good way of translating responsável to English. What would be like more a person in charge of a department or a service, a mission, culture, etc. So these are some of the elements that Urdang observed during her stay in Guinea-Bissau. Also, Dulce Armada, a Cabo Verdean linguist, has written a lot on this lexical modernization of Creole language. Okay. I have a few more slides so we can go to the Q&A section. Now, when it comes to the second aspect of language question, language institution, I want to emphasize that we do not find, at least in my own research, looking at different archives, in-person archives and digital archives, I could not locate one document that explicitly mentioned language policy of these organizations. So what you get is a sort of de facto language policy, kind of hidden, if you will, okay, kind of hidden. I want to argue that the fact that there was no explicit policy had a lot to do with this idea of naturalness and normalness of Portuguese being in such a position. Why writing a policy or writing a rule to dictate that Portuguese is dominant language if that was its natural condition, if you will. Okay. However, we do find some documents that point to Portuguese as the main medium in schools in liberated areas. What is very interesting of liberation struggle in then Portuguese Africa was to do with the construction of proto-state structures in liberated areas. So whether it's in the case of Mozambique or Guinea-Bissau, and to a lesser extent, Angola, we do find establishment of network of schools that were developed to provide education to students. So in Portuguese was the main medium. Nonetheless, when it comes to the actual practice, it was bilingual. Borges, who has written on what she calls militant education in Guinea-Bissau, documents through interviews with those who are either students or teachers at these schools of the use of both Creole and Portuguese. Now, the last part of my paper had to do with language ideology. Social linguists define language ideology as belief system about wordness and functions of a language. So we are trying to understand in terms of mental construction regarding the role, functions, and wordness of different languages. So in terms of local languages, it was clear that one of the key principles that should guide language planning was what I call sequencing, meaning that it was different stages, and each stage needs to be fully, needs to be developed at its fullest before the next stage can take place. For instance, Cabral, when you read him in between lines, you get the sense that he's talking about different stages. First being, studying the language, local language that is. It makes a lot of argument that we need to study. And then the second stage is corpus planning, by creating a complex system that help us understand the internal logic of a language before we can go to the status planning. The status planning meaning the use of language in certain domains like education, public administration, and so on and so forth. It is very interesting, just as a sort of footnote, this sequencing still dominates a lot of language policy debates in Palau, in Portuguese-speaking African countries. One of the, if you really want to understand the mentality of those who oppose the lifting up of local language, you pay attention to their discourse. One thing they often mention is, oh, we need to do more study. So do more study is one way of stalling the advancement of local language. Whenever you hear people saying, we need to do more study before we can engage in a concrete language policy, I guarantee you that the person is probably not in favor of the use of local languages in some of domains of prestige and power. Okay, the case of Guinea-Bissau, I think that another example of language ideology had to do a lot with this. Some scholars call diorthography. It was two different forms of writing, and Cabral talks about it. The example that Cabral mentions is in Canabe, which is Creole for I'm not going. Right? He argues that he writes in Canabe with a C, but while others use a K. You do find this debate, by the way, still to this day in both Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde, which I call the debate between etymologists. This C is obviously borrowed from Portuguese. And bear in mind that before 1990, K was not part of the Portuguese alphabet. So one of the symbolism of introducing K in the writing of Creole was to show Africanness of Creole language, right? So that's the debate I call between etymologists and Pan-Africanists. So how about language ideology regarding Portuguese? Essentially, it stood on the principle of instrumentalism. And here I want to share a couple of quotes, one by Viriato da Cruz, one of the founders of MPLA, and the other by Amilcar Cabral. What is common in those two quotes is this idea that a language, or Portuguese language in specific, is an instrument. Okay, so this ideology, I call it instrumentalism. So what do I mean by instrumentalism? It emphasizes the instrumental function of a language or of language, and not so much of the symbolic function of language. By symbolic function, I mean when language becomes one of the key marker of social identity. So there is not looking at language as a key marker of identity. There's, language is sociologically neutral, if you will, okay? Meaning that, any social group can use any language without have an impact on those social identity. In here, I can just say a brief footnote. They oppose the views of Fanon, Fanon especially in this blackface white mask, makes the argument that to use a language is to carry civilization. If you use in French, that's going to create it's going to create some type of mental deconstruction, which could lead to alienation. Okay. Another stream of argument that I'm still pursuing is to show the connection between this instrumentalist ideology with Stalin's own view on language. We know that these anti-colonial leaders like Viriato da Cruz or Amilcar Cabral, while they were in Lisbon, they read Marxist writers a lot. They had direct connections with the Portuguese Communist Party, which furnished them some of communist literature. So it is very possible that they have read Stalin booklet on titled Marxism and the linguistics. Okay. So for Viriato da Cruz, the two main functions of Portuguese language, because it's an instrument, meaning sociologically neutral, is to it is an important medium that allowed nationalists to combat Portuguese in their own linguistic field. And here we do find a similarity with what was happening in other parts of the African continent. Whether it's a British, what was then called British Africa or French Africa, nationalists, at least the mainstream ones, were using English or French in order to counter their colonialism. The idea behind this position by Viriato da Cruz is that European language was the best tool to criticize European colonial regime. According to Hodgkin, who again wrote in 1957, he argues that African nationalists are asserting claims of a kind that have already been asserted by Europeans. So we do find the using of the same language, the same linguistic system to counter European colonialism. Okay. The other main function of instrumentalism, according to Viriato da Cruz, had to do with the spread of nationalist ideology. In here, Viriato is arguing, or was arguing, I should say, that Portuguese was in many ways the language that permitted cross-ethnic communication, right? And a similar argument was also made by Mondlane with his ideas of Portuguese as a língua de unidade nacional, language of national unity. Okay. So how about Cabral? So in the case of Cabral, I argued that his instrumentalism was a bit different. It constituted what I call pragmatic instrumentalism, in the sense that the reliance on Portuguese as a tool, as a medium, is because Portuguese was already the language of science and the language of modernity. So it's a sort of a shortcut to progress, if you will. By using Portuguese, allows them to gain some time instead of developing local language to perform some of the functions Portuguese was already performing. And there is another dimension in Cabral's thought, that of temporariness, which I shall discuss in a moment. The idea is, for the moment, we're going to rely on Portuguese, but eventually there'll be a new linguistic order, okay? Which is, I'm actually going to skip Maria Pinto Andrade. It's the same kind of ideas, and go to the last section of my paper. So the idea of temporariness. Now we do find two different perspectives on Portuguese language. In Mozambique, particularly under Samora Machel, under Eduardo Modlane, we do find this objective, this idea that what is needed is to retain Portuguese, but to change it, to change its lexical corpus. As Modlane puts it, it's to make sure that the Portuguese has a vocabulary of revolution in order to limit the phraseology of fascism. So it's a one could argue that it's very along the lines of newspeak, perhaps positive newspeak, if you will, George Orwell's newspeak. The idea was essentially to cleanse the Portuguese language. I am almost done. So finally, we have the case of temporariness. Now, we find some of these leaders debating and thinking in terms of what should be the role of language in the post-colony. As I pointed out earlier, Cabral was making the argument that for now, let's just rely on Portuguese because, there is no need to use local language, which would consume lots of resources or time that we do not have. But eventually, he left it open, didn't provide as much of solution, but, one of the sentences that we kind of get the idea is in the future, perhaps Creole language will be also used in some of these domains. Maria Pinto Andrade also in his writing discussed, although superficially, this idea of temporariness. He makes the argument that, for now it's Portuguese, but after independence, a new linguistic order is going to be developed. So this principle of temporariness, obviously, it stands on the notion that Portuguese linguistic supremacy or linguistic dominance is temporary, and with independence, a new linguistic order will be inaugurated. The emphasis is on indigenous and Creole languages. Now, it is not clear whether they were advocating a substitution of local language, Portuguese by local language, or they advocating bilingual or multilingual policy. The importance of this type of ideology is very important because it did inform some of the language ideologies, at least in the early post-colonial period. I want to share with you one example. For instance, Manuel Veiga from Cabo Verde, right after independence, in many of his writing was advocating the principle of substitution. So the idea is, yes, Portuguese was helpful for liberation, but now that we have an autonomous independent state, it's time to make the switch, to make Creole as the sole official language. Okay. So in a nutshell, this is what I have for you. So my concluding remarks, kind of to recapitulate, I try to share with you a little bit in terms of the language question in the context of anti-colonial struggle. I argued, and I hope that I did show that these organizations were essentially multilingual. And I also pointed out that political leadership was correlated with competence in languages of wider communication, particularly French and English. And lastly, I focused on two foundational language ideologies, namely instrumentalism and temporariness. So with that, I finish my presentation and looking forward to your comments, questions.
Abel, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. Let's see, who would like to launch a question first? We will start in the room and then we'll go to the folks on Zoom. Yes, sir.
This was absolutely fascinating, very rich, fast moving, a little faster than I might have adjusted the dial, but very rich and fascinating. Some of the things that I kept wondering while hearing you talk about language choices were corresponding or correlative or analogous decisions being made about other things. Like if they're choosing which words and whose words, are they also choosing which protocols, whose protocols? Like do you use a back and forth series of greetings before you begin to have your conversation? Is there are they speaking about? Are they thinking about who's using which kinds of body language, which kinds of weapons, which kinds of religions, and you get the gist of my question. If you look just outside the boundaries of language as we typically define it, what else are we talking about being decided on? Is there a kind of religious syncretism going on in parallel to the linguistic syncretism of a creolization of Portuguese or of local languages? One of the contexts in which these questions have been studied for several generations, for centuries indeed, is the context of Native American languages and what happened when European colonists or immigrants decided to send all the children of Native America to residential schools, that is boarding schools, and force them to speak English, force them to wear military style clothing, force them to not practice any of their own religions, force them to swallow the whole package. Force them, punish them if they spoke their own languages. There have been more than a century of scholarship on this, and I bet it would be interesting to you to compare. Yeah. Finally, Quranic schooling has a sequencing that is interesting here because you memorize the Quran first before you begin to understand it. Then you go through it again, and people start explaining what it means. So there are several dimensions of questions that you can take your pick. Yeah. If any of them catches your interest. I also wonder about the ghost empire. Portugal is a ghost empire in the world that began with the pretense of Christianizing the world by making them Portuguese, but to make them Christian. Yeah. Where'd that go?
Want to take a shot at that?
Yes. I mean, thank you so much. This some thought-provoking comments and questions. I guess I can start with the last question, being this ghost empire. I like to think that Portuguese was indeed the first European language used in diplomatic interactions. When look, for instance, the first interactions between King of Congo and the King of Portugal was in Portuguese. Obviously, they had some people translating, we do find that. What is also interesting is if you fast forward to the 20th century, despite this discourse of assimilationism, despite this discourse of Luso-tropicalism, which the reality was the presence, the actual presence of Portuguese, the language itself in Africa was very slim. I think that goes along with this idea of ghost empire. In fact, some scholars have pointed out that post-colonial states in Africa have done far more in advancing Portuguese than the 500 years of Portuguese colonialism. So there is one aspect of it. Now, the other question about the use of force and violence against people who use the language, that's what you're saying. The African continent was indeed one of the main laboratory of a violent language policy, especially in education. So the colonial state, in the case of Portugal, those few Africans who were lucky enough to attend a public school, literally they were punished whenever they use local language. There is
physically hit.
Exactly, physical hit. You probably remember in Mozambique, Palmatória, right? I mean, I was not born during the colonial times, but Palmatória is still something that we have in mind when we look at the school system. One of the legacies of colonial school system. Palmatória was often used to punish those who are caught using local language within the school person.
Much like the Native American.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's an interesting book by Michel Cayen from France. He interviewed some of the public intellectuals from Africa, including Amado de Pinto Andrade, and almost all of them recounted their experience, that violent experience in the school system.
Were those schools to which they had chosen to go, or the parents had chosen to put them? Because in the Native American case, the kids were actually kidnapped and put into schools.
I think it's more like I guess you can call it a choice.
Yeah.
I remember that the dual system that exists in terms of classification of Africans.
Yes.
Like those Africans who are lucky enough to be classified as assimilados, they had opportunity to enter the regular public school.
Yes. So it was a
Not the
so it was a privilege to be punished that way.
Well, I wouldn't call that privilege, but I see what you said.
Shall we go? Any other questions in the room? Yes, please.
I have two questions. I see there are a lot of hands up.
Yeah, there are
Make
some
sure
hands up,
kind
so
of
I want to
those.
get to that.
So the first was I was really taken by these slides of the posters of political campaigns that you shared, and kind of to contrast that against the oral, the spoken format that a lot of the leaders were kind of in their translators were operating in, and to ask how kind of deeply intertwined or connected was the development of, like, I guess, these formal written languages to these posters that came out of this period, because you had 1969 Cabral's, like, we could begin to write Creole perhaps in a more formal way, but it seems like these were being developed alongside the fight for the anti-colonial kind of fight here. So I guess the role of these posters in starting to develop some sort of lexicon and figuring out, how are we going to transmit our language through oral, through a written format. And the second question was about on the sort of new linguistic order that would come after independence, and sort of this emphasis on indigenous kind of Creole-based languages. And at least in the case of Cape Verde, and I'm not sure about the other countries you spoke about, but how that sort of new linguistic order very much followed or was based on its closeness to kind of a more Portuguese centered, like with the Parlamento and no, yeah, Movimento and Sotavento, difference like Portuguese or Creole, Creoles, like one, I guess, is perhaps more preferred or more seen as being a proper Creole than another that might be more kind of African influence. So again, how these linguistic order was based or kind of premised on following what the Portuguese text.
Well, thank you so much for those two questions. Obviously, Creole language is one language with different varieties of dialect. As you pointed out in the case of Cabo Verde, you have the northern dialect and the southern dialect. Now, what is interesting to note is language policy in the post-colonial period, especially in the early post-colonial period, was intimately connected with politics in general. For instance, Cabo Verde, after independence, the main political objective, at least expressed by political authorities, was a political unification with Guinea-Bissau. That was the objective, all right, to create one super state. Now, when it came to the language question, right, to deepen that connection, language planners asked which of the varieties in Cabo Verde was closer to the Creole variety in Guinea-Bissau. So the southern variety was closer. So just to give an example, in 1979 at the colloquium on Creole language in Cabo Verde, they advocated that the southern dialect should be the main dialect for standardization because of its connection with the Guinea-Bissau. Right? If you're going to create one super state, might as well looking at which of those two varieties is closer. The other element we should also look at is language debate in Cabo Verde still to this day, and in Guinea-Bissau has a lot to do with debates on identity. Right? You find many folks that advocate that Southern Islands are, I'm using the expression that's quite used among them, more African, and Northern Islands more European. In fact, a new book was recently published by an anthropologist that basically makes the claims that, an old claim, by the way, that Cabo Verde is culturally European. That's the main argument, has nothing to do with Africa. So you do find this. Needless to say, when you put this debate with language debate, what we do find is the argument that northern varieties are closer to the Portuguese language and southern varieties are closer to West African languages. So that's some of the things that we may want to think of. Now, the other question is, while you were asking those questions, this is just to connect the debate during the anti-colonial period with what is happening right now. So if at that time, the main ideology was instrumentalism, right? Portuguese is sociologically neutral, is a tool that we can use to advance our political objectives. The main ideology these days across the palette, across of Portuguese speaking countries is what they call the ideology of co-ownership, meaning that now they claim Portuguese as theirs. They claim that their identity, national identity, is rooted in Portuguese. So, we do find a lot of discourse, in terms of this co-ownership, especially on May 5th, which is International Day of Portuguese Language. If you happen to read any news from Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé, there is always this idea that, it's our language, we need to defend it, promote it. They were even part of the CPLP, Commonwealth of Portuguese-speaking countries, okay? So to address the other question very briefly, so there was no concrete language planning. My understanding, especially in the case of Guinea-Bissau, my understanding is that the liberation movement, they want to rationalize resources and time. So while in some instances they did use Creole, as I showed it, as we progress over time, we do find an increasing use of Portuguese and also a decreasing use of local language. As a matter of fact, in terms of posters, in Creole or in local languages, in case of Mozambique and Angola, we do not find as many compared to the early 1960s.
Okay. We have several questions from Zoom land, and I really would like to get to them. We're already beginning to run out of time. So could I ask folks that I call on who are on via Zoom, if you could unmute yourselves and when we call on you, and then try to ask your question concisely so we can try to get through the three that I see. We already lost, unfortunately, Tim Longman, who had a question but had to go. So Suzanne Muller, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, thank you. This will be a quick one. In spite of all the particulars that you note about the use of language in former Portuguese territories, it strikes me that there are more similarities and differences if you look at other colonies with other oranges, whether French or English. So my question is, whether you agree with that or not, or if you have any other comments on that. And then just one quick comment was I was interested in the role of language as a class differentiator, which you hadn't mentioned, but it certainly was true of other colonies. So that's it. Was that short enough?
Actually,
well done.
If you could repeat the first part because I didn't get it.
What I was saying is that a lot of the points you make about the use of Portuguese or indigenous languages in the Portuguese colonies were not that different than the use of language in other colonies, whether the English or French, as opposed to indigenous languages, including their role in the independence struggle. So I'm wondering if you agree with that, or if not, if there are any differences that you think I should know about.
No, I do agree, and it is very interesting because scholars of colonialism often like to make a distinction between a British indirect rule versus French Portuguese direct rule, and one of the key premises of direct rule is this idea that of overuse of the French language, but when we pay attention to the colonial system, whether in the French Africa or Portuguese Africa, we do find a very similar way of domination, which is essentially indirect. And indirect rule entails the use of local language. I mean, the commandant de cercle had to use local language in order to impose himself. The same thing with the lowest level of Portuguese of colonial officials that dealing with the local population. So yes, I do agree. But there is one dimension which we do not find, language dimension, that we don't find in other parts of Africa as they were fighting for independence. In British and French Africa, particularly in West Africa, we do not find a lot of diplomacy of liberation. So political conflict was essentially what you may call it an internal conflict, meaning they had to deal directly with policymakers from Paris or London. There was not a lot of intervention or at least appeal to international actors. Now, in the case of Portuguese Africa, we do find diplomacy of liberation was a major feature that explained the use, the introduction and use of French and English. First French, and and later on we see a lot of use of English. The idea was to gather and to rally as much international support from around the world.
Okay. Josh Castillo, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for this amazing and fascinating presentation. So I can kind of shorten what I was saying. I realize it's kind of interacting also with Suzanne's question here. So I thought it was fascinating, and you talked about this a bit. That's basically the going from this kind of 1960s, 70s approach that you're talking about, and these anti-colonial nationalists having a kind of pragmatic, practical approach to embracing Portuguese. Comparing that to now, where it's particularly, I think, in Mozambique and Angola, Portuguese is much more established than other European languages in other former colonies. So I'm just wondering what you see as the kind of differentiator in that sort of post-colonial experience in these former Portuguese colonies. Yeah. But thanks so much for.
Yes, Josh, that was a great question. I think that the irony of language spread in post-colonial Mozambique and Angola had a lot to do with civil war. So civil war had to do with the many rural population moving to urban areas. And in urban areas, contact with Portuguese became not only deeper, but more intense. So if you go to cities like Maputo or Angola these days, you do find, that Portuguese or a variety of Portuguese has become the main medium of communication. So the key variable, it seems to me, had to do with decades of civil conflict in Angola and Mozambique. But however, in the case of Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde is a bit different. We do find a sort of a social ascension of Creole language. Scholars like to talk about diglossia, meaning that, sort of a hierarchy between those two languages. But it is interesting to note that in those two states, Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde, Creole language now is increasingly used in domains of power. You can, parliamentary debate, or even some of the presidential speeches are now in Creole, but you don't find, at least to my knowledge, as much in Mozambique or in Angola.
Okay, thank you. I see another hand up in Zoomland. Forgive me if I get this pronunciation correct. Jairzinho Lopez Ferreira, would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
No worries about the pronunciation because no one normally gets it right. So, Abel, I really want to congratulate you for this outstanding presentation, and I'll try to be as briefly as possible. I'm lucky enough to have access to you. We have plenty of time to discuss later. What I would like to ask you has to do with the missionary agreement of 1940, which is like kind of another document side by side with the Concordat of 1940, and it has to do with the language issue. I agree with Suzanne that these similarities are rather strong, and I would go even further by saying that this imposition on the language of the Portuguese language in the Portuguese empires dates back actually to the end of 19th century. But what I would like to ask you, as you know, my main interest in this sort of historical research is church history. I would like to ask you the following. Have you found any sort of disparity between in interactions between secular and ecclesiastical entities and bodies in the context of anti-colonialism, the incentive or stimuli to use native language as language of evangelization? Because in this issue we have the Holy See on one side, trying to promote evangelization in the native language, although it did a concession to Salazar in 1940. But on the other hand, we have missionaries, both native and missionary clergy, often advocating, for example, in Cape Verde, for the use of Creole in evangelization. What have you found so far on this regard? Because I'm profoundly interested in this matter, and I have a plan of my own. So if you can help me a bit, I would appreciate a great deal.
Thank you so much, Jairzinho. Really interesting question. Two things that I want to point it out. For the colonial states, so the secular aspect, as I showed in my presentation, we do see the use of local language, especially in 1960s and 1970s, which was part of the counterinsurgency strategy. So the idea is how to demobilize the local population, and the shortcut was to rely on local language. The second point is we may want to see, and this is something that I've done much research, perhaps a similar approach was done by my missionaries. Remember that the collaboration and even the intimate relationship that existed between clergy in the colonies and the Estado Novo and the colonial state. So it is very likely that Portuguese Catholic clergy did receive some cues from the colonial state and tried to replicate some of these linguistic habitus, if you will, in the evangelization. However, when it comes to provide with the actual documentation, this is something that I need to do a little bit more digging.
Abel, what I actually am asking is the other way around. If you found anti-colonial leaders like Cabral and Mário Pinto de Andrade and so on, trying to capitalize upon the clergy, native clergy, for example, to the use of native language.
In a way, yes. Remember that Mário Pinto Andrade's brother, who was one of the founders of NPLA, he was a priest, a Catholic priest.
Joaquim, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we do find that connection. In fact, as you know, one of the major triumphs of this organization was when they met the Pope in Rome. So one could make the argument that they did seek to approach religion and Catholicism because they did understand that by subverting by changing the connection with the Roman Catholic at the local level, at international level, would assist in deconstructing Portuguese colonialism.
Okay.
I see that Professor Jim McCann has a question. Jim, if you'd like to, we have only about 2 minutes left, but.
Okay, very quick. This is a broad question. The one element I didn't see in your talk, and I appreciate very much the talk, wonderful breadth that you show here, is Bahia. Bahia is the most African influenced part of Brazil in cultural terms and linguistic terms. Is it part of your approach to include Bahia? Bahia Salvador.
No, for a simple reason, because if we look at the interactions between Portuguese-speaking African countries and Brazil and the relation during the anti-colonial movement, it was strong in early 1960s. But then with dictatorship, military dictatorship being imposed in Brazil, we do find actually a sort of those two going to different ways. Perhaps one argument that one would probably make is it is recently that we see the establishment of connection at the not at the state level, but at the population level between the Palopes and Brazil. But that link was broken in 1964 with the advent of military dictatorship. So Bahia did not play any major role, symbolic or otherwise, in national liberation.
But I'm a historian, so I go back much further than the 1960s, and we'll talk to John Thornton about that. So thank you very much. Terrific.
Okay, we have run out of time, which will not stop us from getting one last word from Parker Chipton. But it has to be one word, a one-word question.
This is not worth
why?
This is not worth a last word, but I would like to contrast the Kenyan case, perhaps, where missionaries stood up as staunch defenders of local people against colonial government. The second question is, and I'm cheating, I'm afraid. Again, I'm drawing from Kenyan experience and other Anglophone countries where the use of Swahili and the use of English marginalized women who had not been to school at a certain age and in a certain stage in history. They'd not been to school, so they couldn't participate in these conversations and struggles. Did you find something like that in
So the gender imbalance,
what
that's
some
what,
used to call Lusophone Africa?
but are you talking about the gender imbalance?
Yes,
Um,
and age and gender, because the older women had not been to school and had not learned English, and many had not learned Swahili, so they were out of the conversations.
So two things need to be said very quickly. First, the ideological inclination of looking at liberation also from perspective of gender. You know, if you read Mondlane, Mauro Machel, and Mr. Cabral, they all talked about, you know, as part of the deal of liberation includes what they call women's liberation.
Right.
That's one part of it. And the second is, and this perhaps plays it's deeper in the case of Guinea-Bissau than in other colonies. Women did play an important role during the struggle. You do find many women who are actually military commanders. So, and you know, if you want to connect that with the language, it has to do more with the Creole language per se, and a little bit of competence on Portuguese language. But you do find some of the women that play a significant role in the struggle.
Okay, we're going to have to call it quits. Although you can see you've provoked a lot of questions with this.
And now that we're talking about Israel, but women in the army.
Yeah.
Oh, please don't raise that question. Abel, thank you so much. It's a wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Really enjoyed it. For all of those of you who are watching, I'd like to note what I forgot to mention at the beginning, which is that Abel Amado is a recipient of an educational outreach grant for including course content in Africa, related to Africa in the work that he's doing at Simmons University. So we're most delighted that this relationship with the African Studies Center is alive and living, not just through this talk, but ongoing. For all those of you who are online and here, please note that the Walter Rodney Seminar Series continues. The next version will be a week from today. Christopher Graham will speak on Echo Villages Revisited, the role of the media, political ideology, and public opinion in regreening Africa. On April 8th, Christina Shaka will be here talking about Ethiopia and the art of cross-cultural exchange. And that's related to the museum exhibit at the, which museum is it? Peabody Essex Museum. So that'll be fascinating. On the 15th of April, Josh Castillo is going to be here speaking about navigating Lingala, linguistic capital, political power, and social mobility in Congo Zaire, closely related subjects to your own work. And Cécile Fromont will be here on the 29th of April, talking about history and the fetish. And I don't even understand this. I have to admit, the Del Commune in Kisi as historical object? Wow, whatever that is. For all those of you who are great African Studies Center aficionados, there are other things going on that you would want to know about. On the 20th of March, Cinémafrique will be watching and discussing, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Tazeka from Morocco. And on March 27th, the French book group will be discussing Silence of the Chagos by Shanaz Patel. On April 3rd, busy day for us, African Literature Discussion Group will be discussing The Season of Crimson Blossoms by Abu Bakr Adam Ibrahim. On April 3rd as well, there will be the African Language Theater Night, which if you haven't been to one of these, honestly, it is a hoot and a half. So it's definitely, it's so much fun. And what's more, it's going to be even more fun this year because we're serving a full meal. I know we do that sometimes anyway, but there'll be an African community dinner as well associated with that. April 24th, film screening, there'll be some screening too. Stealing a Nation, which is from Mauritius. And on April 27th, Understanding the History of the Chagos Islands, which I've never been to. So I've got a long way to go to understand the history. So we've got a busy schedule coming up for all of you who are interested in these subjects. Abel, thank you again for coming over. We're delighted to have you here, and thanks for a great presentation.
No, thank you.
All right, everyone. Okay.
I can tell you have too many questions.